Some people leave quietly not because they want to, but because no one ever learned how to listen. The café sat on a familiar American corner where traffic hummed and steam curled from paper cups, a place that prided itself on warmth and community. Mara Ellison paused just inside the door, letting the bell vibrate uselessly above her head. She was deaf, born into a world that moved its mouth faster than its hands, and she had learned long ago that entry did not guarantee inclusion. She chose a small table near the window, the one that offered the illusion of participation without demanding it. Around her, conversations braided together in careless abundance. Laughter rose and fell, faces tilted toward one another, hands punctuating stories she could not hear and rarely received in translation. Mara watched lips move without invitation, smiles exchanged without her. She met eyes, offered a polite nod, then watched those eyes slide away, pulled back into the gravity of sound. The barista's greeting came and went as a blur, a practiced kindness that ended at the counter. No one noticed that Mara never responded, that her silence was not disinterest but displacement. Her loneliness had never been about the absence of noise. It was about the absence of effort. From classrooms where teachers forgot to face her, to jobs where meetings ended before someone remembered to summarize, she had learned that misunderstanding could be more exhausting than exclusion. Here, in the café's lively chaos, the noise felt heavier than quiet. It pressed in, isolating her further, a reminder that belonging was often reserved for those who could hear it called out loud. At a larger table near the center, Daniel Reed sat with the posture of a man always bracing for collapse. A single father, he measured life in schedules and checklists and lunches packed and permission slips signed. His emotional world had narrowed after years of being left, first by circumstance, then by choice. Responsibility had taught him efficiency, not tenderness. He watched the clock more than the room, counting minutes until the next obligation. His 3 children, triplets with an uncanny shared rhythm, leaned into the world differently. Where Daniel scanned for exits and empty chairs, the children scanned faces. They noticed the elderly woman struggling with a lid, the teenager pretending not to be alone, the way some people carried themselves like questions. Their attention was quiet but persistent, a kind of listening that did not depend on ears alone. The café grew louder as lunchtime approached. Chairs scraped, orders piled up, and the air thickened with overlapping energy. To most it felt alive. To Mara, it felt like standing behind glass while a party happened just out of reach. She sipped her coffee slowly, tracing the condensation on the cup, grounding herself in the tactile world that had always been more reliable than sound. When she looked up, she caught a child's gaze, one of the triplets, steady and curious, not hurried away by embarrassment or distraction. Daniel missed it. He was counting napkins, mentally calculating the afternoon. He did not see Mara's shoulders tense when someone laughed too loudly nearby, or the way her eyes searched for something to anchor to. He did not see the small, practiced smile she wore, the one designed to make others comfortable, even as it cost her something each time. The children, however, kept watching. They noticed how people spoke around Mara but never to her, how their father's attention slid past her as easily as everyone else's. They sensed a mismatch between the café's promise of community and the reality unfolding at the window table. Their awareness was not pity, but recognition, an instinctive understanding that someone was being left outside without anyone noticing the door. Mara finished her drink and stood. Leaving had become a skill, refined over years of exits that drew no comment. She gathered her bag, smoothing the strap as if preparing herself for the familiar weight of departure. The café continued on, unaltered by her movement. Chairs filled, voices overlapped, and no one marked the moment as significant. As she turned toward the door, the triplets shifted in their seats, a shared glance passing between them. Daniel remained focused on logistics, unaware that something important was slipping away. The children's attention sharpened, drawn to the quiet departure that felt wrong in a place meant to be welcoming. Just as Mara reached for the door, the triplets recognized what the noise had hidden, and their realization threatened to change more than a single unnoticed exit. When life abandons someone repeatedly, they learn to stop expecting connection. Daniel Reed had not always been this careful with his heart, but experience had trained him well. Loss had arrived early and stayed long enough to rearrange his priorities. First came the quiet erosion of a marriage that ended not with shouting but with distance, the kind that grows unnoticed until it becomes remanent. Then came the realization that promises, even well-meant ones, could dissolve under pressure. What remained was responsibility, solid, unavoidable, and safer than hope. Single parenthood tightened his world into manageable shapes. Days were broken into lists, nights into routines that left little room for improvisation. He woke before the children, packed identical lunches, memorized school calendars, and calculated expenses down to the smallest margin. Structure became his shelter. Survival required predictability, and predictability required emotional restraint. There was no space for risks that might unravel what little stability he had built. Emotional openness felt dangerous because it carried memories of disappointment. Daniel had learned that caring deeply often came with an invoice he could not afford to pay. Letting people in meant trusting them not to leave, and trust had become a liability. He convinced himself that detachment was maturity, that keeping feelings contained was the same as being strong. It was easier to manage tasks than expectations, easier to solve problems than sit with uncertainty. Exhaustion followed him everywhere, but it wore a convincing disguise. To outsiders, his tiredness looked like indifference. In truth, it was the weight of constant vigilance, the mental load of being everything at once. He loved his children fiercely, but even that love was filtered through duty. He showed up, provided, protected. What he struggled to do was pause long enough to feel anything beyond the next obligation. Moments that invited vulnerability made him uneasy. He avoided conversations that lingered, sidestepped questions that reached beyond logistics. When teachers praised the children's empathy, he nodded politely and changed the subject. Compliments felt like expectations in disguise, and expectations had a way of turning into disappointments. He preferred the certainty of action to the ambiguity of emotion. The triplets grew up within this quiet framework. They learned responsibility early, not because they were asked to, but because they observed it constantly. They watched their father measure words carefully, saw how he redirected affection into action. Yet where Daniel withdrew, they leaned in. His restraint became their reference point, a boundary they instinctively tested with curiosity rather than rebellion. They noticed what he overlooked. Where Daniel saw efficiency, they saw absence. They learned to read faces, to sense when someone needed attention even if they did not ask for it. Emotional awareness became their shared language, a way of navigating a world that often moved too fast to notice the quiet. They did not judge their father for his reserve. They simply filled the spaces it left behind. In the café, Daniel's focus remained fixed on keeping the children settled and on schedule. He did not register the subtle shifts happening around him. He missed the way the room's energy changed when someone stood to leave, the way silence could be louder than noise. His mind was already moving ahead to the afternoon, to errands and obligations waiting beyond the door. The children, however, felt the moment. They sensed a familiar pattern unfolding, one they had seen too many times in different forms. Someone was slipping away unnoticed, and the room was complicit in its indifference. Their father's emotional distance had taught them something important. If you do not act, absence becomes permanent. Daniel remained unaware of the lesson they were about to apply. He had not prepared for his children to challenge the rules he lived by, to step into a space he had carefully avoided. His world, built small and predictable to keep pain at bay, was about to be tested by the very empathy he had unknowingly nurtured. As the children moved in unison, responding to what he could not see, Daniel realized too late that his carefully controlled world was about to expand in a way he never planned for, and might not know how to stop. Children often understand exclusion before they understand its cause. The triplets' empathy had not appeared by accident. It had been shaped by instability they were too young to name but old enough to feel. Growing up with a single parent who carried quiet fatigue like a second shadow had taught them to watch closely. They learned early that emotions were not always spoken, that the most important signals were often the ones adults ignored. In homes where certainty was fragile, awareness became a form of safety, and paying attention meant staying connected. They read the world through faces and posture rather than words. A tight jaw meant stress, a lowered gaze meant withdrawal, a lingering pause meant someone wanted to be noticed, but did not know how to ask. This sensitivity made them unusually attuned to the spaces between people. They did not need explanations to sense when someone felt apart from a room. Their understanding was instinctive, unburdened by the categories adults relied on to explain discomfort. In the cafe, this difference became clear. Adults shifted uneasily around Mara Ellison, unsure how to engage, their discomfort disguised as politeness or avoidance. Disability, to them, was something to tiptoe around, an unspoken boundary best respected by distance. The triplets saw none of that at first. What they noticed was simpler and more human. They saw a woman sitting alone while others clustered together, her eyes following conversations she could not enter. They saw her offer small smiles that went unanswered, gestures that dissolved before they landed. Their openness contrasted sharply with the guarded energy of the room. Where adults hesitated, the children leaned forward. Where others averted their gaze, the triplets held it. They did not register Mara as different. They registered her as alone. The distinction mattered. It allowed compassion to arrive before judgment, curiosity before fear. In their world, attention was not a risk but a gift. The moment crystallized when Mara stood to leave. Chairs scraped and voices overlapped, yet the children felt the shift immediately. Departure carried a weight they recognized, the familiar heaviness of someone exiting without ceremony. They watched her gather her things with practiced efficiency, the movements of someone used to leaving quietly. To them it felt wrong, like a story ending too soon without acknowledgement. Daniel noticed their stillness before he noticed the reason for it. He followed their gaze, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to understand what had captured their attention. Uncertainty settled in. He sensed that something important was happening but could not quite name it. Years of emotional restraint had dulled his ability to respond quickly to moments that required vulnerability. He hesitated, caught between habit and instinct. The children did not wait for clarity. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement forged through years of shared observation. Acting together felt natural, safer than acting alone. They had learned that when something mattered, delay only made absence permanent. Their father's pause became the space they stepped into, not in defiance but in completion of something he could not finish. They rose slightly in their seats, attention fixed on Mara as she moved toward the door. Their expressions were open, unguarded, free of the calculations that complicated adult kindness. To them, this was not about difference or difficulty. It was about presence. Someone was leaving, and they wanted her to know she had been seen. Daniel's uncertainty deepened as he realized the children were about to do something unscripted. His instinct was to rein them in, to restore order. But another part of him recognized the sincerity in their focus. This was not misbehavior. It was intention. The predictability he relied on began to loosen, replaced by a quiet awareness that his children were responding to a truth he had overlooked. The cafe continued its hum, unaware of the shift unfolding at one table. Mara reached the door, hand hovering near the handle, ready to step back into a world that rarely paused for her. Behind her, 3 small figures leaned forward, their resolve steady. Daniel watched, caught between fear of exposure and a growing sense that something meaningful was about to happen. In a room full of noise and hesitation, the triplets raised their hands together, and in that simple, unified gesture, everything prepared to change. Sometimes connection does not come through sound. It comes through effort. The triplets' hands lifted with a confidence that surprised even them. Their knowledge of sign language was modest, gathered in fragments from school assemblies, online videos watched out of curiosity, and moments when learning felt more like play than responsibility. It was never meant for performance. It was something they carried quietly, like a tool you hope you never need but are grateful to have when the moment arrives. They signed slowly, their movements careful and imperfect, shaped by memory rather than fluency. The gestures were not polished, and a trained eye would have caught the mistakes immediately. Yet the intention behind them was unmistakable. This was not mimicry or novelty, it was an offering. They were saying hello, saying wait, saying you are seen, using the only language that felt right in that instant. Mara felt it before she fully understood it. The sensation reached her first as a shift in the air, a pause that did not demand departure. She turned, expecting the usual awkward smiles or hurried apologies that often followed moments of misunderstanding. Instead, she saw 3 children, hands moving with earnest concentration, eyes fixed on her, not with curiosity, but with care. The surprise caught in her chest, stopping her breath even as her world remained silent. For a moment she did nothing. Years of conditioned response urged her to keep moving, to avoid the vulnerability that often accompanied attention. But this was different. There was no pity in their faces, no sense of obligation or performance. They were not trying to help her. They were trying to reach her. The distinction mattered more than she could immediately articulate. Their signs were simple, halting, but alive with sincerity. Each movement carried effort, the kind that acknowledges another person's reality rather than asking them to adapt. Mara's practiced composure wavered. She had grown used to being accommodated in ways that felt transactional, assistance offered without understanding. This was neither. It was presence, unguarded and genuine. Daniel watched from his chair, something loosening in his chest as the scene unfolded. He had always believed communication required control, clarity, and sound. What he saw challenged that belief. His children were speaking without voices, and somehow saying more than he ever had with words. The absence of sound did not diminish the exchange. It sharpened it, stripping away distractions until only meaning remained. The cafe seemed to recede as silence transformed from barrier to bridge. Mara responded, her hands moving with a confidence born of lifelong use. She adjusted her pace to meet theirs, patient and encouraging, her expression softening as she realized she did not need to simplify herself here. The children followed her lead, learning in real time, adapting without fear of being wrong. Mistakes became part of the conversation rather than obstacles to it. There was no audience in their minds, though others began to notice. This was not a spectacle. It was an exchange grounded in mutual respect. Mara felt something unfamiliar settle in, a sense of being chosen, not as an exception or responsibility, but as a person worth the effort. Loneliness, which had so often been her companion in public spaces, loosened its grip. Daniel Fay, LT, exposed and strangely grateful. He recognized the resilience he had taught his children through necessity, now expressed as compassion. Their willingness to stay, to engage when leaving would have been easier, reflected a lesson he had lived but rarely named. Staying mattered. Showing up mattered, even when uncertainty made it uncomfortable. Time stretched in a way it rarely did for any of them. The noise of the cafe returned gradually, but it no longer dominated the moment. Silence had been redefined, no longer empty but full, carrying understanding instead of isolation. Mara felt seen in a way that did not require explanation or defense. The children felt the quiet satisfaction of having acted on instinct and finding it right. Daniel realized that what he was witnessing was not just kindness, but a reimagining of family, one built not on obligation or biology, but on choice. His children had opened a door he had kept closed out of fear, and through it came the possibility of connection he had long believed was too risky to pursue. Mara stood there, hands lowering slowly, her body no longer angled toward the exit, the weight of departure lifted, replaced by a tentative warmth. She had come prepared to leave unnoticed. Instead, she found herself rooted in place, held by a moment that asked nothing of her except to remain. The door stayed closed behind her as Mara chose not to walk away, and in that stillness, a new beginning quietly waited to be acknowledged. Being understood reaches deeper than being included. Mara Ellison had spent most of her life navigating spaces that welcomed her conditionally. Doors were held open, captions added late, instructions repeated outer instead of clearer. These gestures were rarely cruel, but they were rarely complete. They framed her as a problem, be solved, rather than a person to be known. Over time, she learned to accept accommodation without expectation, to be grateful for access, even when connection was missing. Emotional isolation settled in quietly through years of small dismissals, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, jokes shared without context, decisions made around her instead of with her. People often meant well, but their kindness stopped at convenience. She was included structurally, yet excluded relationally. It taught her to shrink her expectations, to take up less emotional space so others would not feel burdened by her presence. What unfolded in the cafe disrupted that pattern without effort or announcement. The triplets did not slow their gestures out of caution or exaggerate them out of sympathy. They signed as they were, curious, focused, unembarrassed by imperfection. They did not ask permission to engage or wait for instruction on how to behave. Their acceptance was immediate, rooted not in understanding deafness as a concept, but in recognizing her as someone worth reaching. Mara felt the shift internally before it registered on her face. There was no need to explain herself, no need to translate her experience into something palatable. The children were not managing her, they were meeting her. That difference released something she had been holding for years. Her shoulders eased, her breath steadied, and emotion surfaced without demanding words. It was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was simply relief. She responded naturally, her expressions animated. Hands fluid and confident. For once, she did not have to slow down or simplify. The children followed with determination, mirroring her movements, adjusting when they faltered. Effort replaced hesitation. Learning replaced fear. Through that shared focus, attachment began to form, not instantly, but authentically, built on mutual investment rather than obligation. The triplets felt it too, though they lacked the language to define it. They sensed that what they were doing mattered, not because it was kind, but because it was real. Their attention deepened, their curiosity expanding beyond the moment. Connection, they discovered, was something you built actively, not something granted by proximity. Staying present required energy, but it returned something richer in exchange. Daniel watched the exchange with a mixture of awe and unease. He recognized the unfamiliar territory they were entering, one he had avoided for years. Emotional exposure had always felt like a risk he could not afford, a crack through which loss might return. Yet here was his children's resilience, not hardened by restraint, but softened by empathy. They were not protecting themselves from feeling. They were choosing to feel anyway. That realization unsettled him. It challenged the framework he had built to survive. He saw how his fear of connection had shaped his world into something efficient but narrow. In contrast, this moment was inefficient, unscripted, and profoundly human. It asked nothing practical of him, yet demanded emotional presence. For the first time in a long while, he did not retreat from that demand. Mara noticed him then, standing, at the edge of the moment, uncertain but attentive. There was no expectation placed on him, no pressure to perform. His willingness to stay, to witness without interrupting, mattered more than any gesture he could have made. It signaled safety, a quiet permission for the moment to continue unfolding without being rushed to resolution. Time moved differently, as understanding settled into the space between them. The cafe's noise faded into irrelevance. What remained was a shared stillness, full rather than empty. Mara realized she was not counting the seconds anymore, not preparing an exit. She was present, chosen by circumstance and sustained by intention. This was not charity or coincidence. It was the beginning of something shaped by choice, by children who stayed when leaving would have been easier, by a father who allowed himself to witness vulnerability, by a woman who no longer felt she had to disappear to keep others comfortable. Hope did not arrive loudly. It arrived through continuity, through the sense that this moment could extend beyond itself. Mara felt it then, unmistakably. This connection was not fragile or accidental. It had weight, direction, and the quiet promise of becoming more if allowed to grow. As the moment stretched and refused to dissolve, it became clear that what had begun as a simple exchange was turning into something none of them could walk away from unchanged. Connection often forms before anyone agrees to it. What followed did not feel like a decision, it felt like a continuation. The awkward distance that usually hovered after moments of unexpected interaction never returned. Instead, emotional presence settled naturally into the space between them, as if it had been waiting for permission that no one needed to give. No one announced the shift, yet everyone felt it. The café was still the same, but the air around their table carried a different weight. The triplets remained engaged with a steadiness that surprised even their father. They did not grow restless or self-conscious. Their attention did not flicker once the novelty passed. Because this had never been about novelty. They stayed oriented toward Mara, responding to her expressions, adjusting their hands when she guided them gently. Their focus was calm, grounded, as if they understood that consistency was what made the moment safe. Mara experienced something she rarely allowed herself to feel in public spaces, belonging without explanation. She was not asked to justify her presence or educate anyone about her life. There were no careful glances toward exits, no subtle pressure to keep things brief. She was simply there, included in the rhythm of the moment, not as an exception, but as a participant. The ease of it caught her off guard. She noticed how her body responded before her mind did. She leaned in instead of away. Her expression softened, her movements less guarded. Years of learned caution began to loosen, replaced by a tentative trust. This was not a place she had prepared to stay, yet staying felt natural, almost inevitable. Loneliness, so familiar it had once felt permanent, weakened its grip quietly. Daniel sat with a growing awareness that something fundamental was shifting. Safety, he realized, had never truly come from control or predictability. It came from presence, from allowing moments to unfold without immediately managing them. Watching his children engage so fully, he felt his long-held definitions begin to blur. Protecting them had always meant limiting risk, but here they were, emotionally open and steady, not harmed by connection but strengthened by it. He allowed himself to remain still, resisting the urge to redirect or conclude the interaction. That choice alone felt significant. Staying had always been harder than leaving, especially when emotions were involved. Yet he stayed, witnessing a form of healing that did not demand acknowledgement or labels. It was happening whether he named it or not. Healing moved through the moment quietly. There were no declarations, no sudden transformations. It unfolded in small adjustments, in shared attention and unspoken understanding. Mara did not feel fixed or saved, and the children did not feel heroic. What they shared was simpler and deeper, mutual recognition. The cafe's background noise continued, but it no longer dominated their awareness. Isolation, once so solid, began to feel less certain. It did not vanish, but it loosened, as if reminded that it was not the only possible state. Mara sensed that this connection did not erase her past experiences, yet it offered something equally powerful, a counterweight. Proof that effort could replace avoidance, that presence could emerge without obligation. Daniel noticed how his breathing had slowed, how the tight vigilance he carried daily had eased. He was not solving anything, not preparing for what came next. He was simply there. In that stillness, he recognized a quiet redemption forming, driven not by grand gestures, but by hope grounded in continuity. This moment mattered because it was allowed to last. Time stretched gently until the outside world began to press in again. Cups emptied, chairs shifted, and the cafe's rhythm reasserted itself. The practical realities Daniel relied on began to surface at the edges of his mind. Schedules waited, responsibilities returned. The awareness brought a familiar tension, a reminder that moments like this were often temporary. Mara felt it too, the subtle pull of reality urging her not to expect too much. She had learned to treasure moments without assuming they would extend beyond themselves. Yet something about this felt unfinished, unresolved in a way that invited continuation rather than closure. Leaving now would not feel like slipping away unnoticed. It would feel like interruption. The triplets sensed the shift before either adult spoke. Their posture changed slightly, attention sharpening as if bracing for separation. They had stayed when others left, and now they faced the possibility that this, too, might end. Their expressions carried quiet determination, an unspoken resistance to letting the connection dissolve without acknowledgement. As the pull of schedules and obligations crept closer, reality threatened to reclaim the moment, and each of them felt the fragile question of whether what had begun would be allowed to continue. Fear grows loudest when hope feels real. As the moment lingered, fear began to surface in quiet, familiar ways. For Mara, it arrived as a tightening in her chest, a reminder shaped by experience rather than imagination. She had felt this edge before, right after connection began to feel possible. Too often, interest faded once effort became inconvenient, once curiosity gave way to routine. Misunderstanding usually followed closeness, and misunderstanding was often the first step toward being left behind. Her mind traced well-worn paths. She wondered how long patience would last, how soon frustration might replace warmth. People rarely intended harm, yet they drifted away when communication required more than ease. Staying had never been guaranteed. The fear was not dramatic, but it was persistent, urging caution, reminding her that hope could make loss sharper. Daniel felt his own version of that warning rise up. Emotional responsibility beyond survival had always frightened him more than exhaustion. He knew how to provide, how to endure, how to keep life functional. What he did not know was how to sustain connection without losing control of the structure he depended on. Caring deeply had once cost him stability, and the memory still shaped his choices. He worried about what staying present might require from him tomorrow, next week, months from now. Connection felt expansive, but expansion came with risk. He had learned to keep his world small for a reason. Letting it grow meant inviting unpredictability, and unpredictability had once dismantled everything he thought was secure. Between them, the triplets remained steady. They did not sense fear in the same way, or perhaps they did but had not yet learned to obey it. Their consistency acted as an anchor, grounding the moment when uncertainty threatened to fracture it. They stayed engaged, not clinging, not withdrawing, simply present in the way children often are when they trust their instincts. Their calm presence softened the space. It reminded both adults that fear did not have to dictate the outcome. The children were not unaware of difficulty. They were just unburdened by anticipation of loss. They responded to what was happening, not to what might happen later. In that simplicity, there was strength. Mara felt herself standing at a familiar crossroads between retreat and courage. She could step back now, preserve the moment as a rare kindness, and leave before expectation formed. That choice had protected her many times before. Yet something about this connection resisted being folded away as a memory. It had substance. It asked for honesty instead of disappearance. Daniel faced the same internal struggle from the opposite direction. He could gently redirect his children, thank Mara with a polite gesture, and move on. That path was familiar, efficient, and emotionally contained. But watching his children's quiet determination, he sensed that avoiding vulnerability now would teach them a lesson he no longer believed in. Retreat would keep them safe in one sense, but smaller in another. Avoidance began to lose its appeal as honesty edged in. No one spoke grand truths or made promises, yet emotional transparency emerged in subtler ways. Daniel allowed his attention to remain open rather than guarded. Mara allowed her expression to reflect uncertainty without masking it. Neither tried to manage the moment into something safer or simpler. Fear did not vanish, but it shifted. Instead of dictating action, it became something acknowledged, something carried rather than obeyed. Courage, they discovered, was not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let it end the moment prematurely. Staying present became an active choice rather than a passive occurrence. The children sensed the shift and responded with renewed focus, as if aware that something important was being decided without words. Their steadiness communicated reassurance more effectively than explanation could have. They were not asking for permanence, only continuity. Stay now. That was enough. Mara noticed how her fear changed shape. It no longer warned her to leave, but invited her to be careful without being closed. She realized that being chosen, even briefly, did not obligate her to predict the future. It allowed her to exist fully in the present, without bracing for loss before it arrived. Daniel felt a similar realization settle in. Responsibility did not always mean carrying everything alone. Sometimes it meant allowing space for others to share emotional weight, even if that space felt unfamiliar. Staying did not mean surrendering control. It meant redefining what safety looked like. In that shared awareness, something fundamental shifted. They were no longer strangers connected by coincidence. They were people actively choosing presence despite fear. That choice altered the texture of the moment, giving it depth and intention. As they held that understanding together, one quiet realization emerged. This connection was no longer just happening to them. It was something they were choosing to see, and it changed how each of them understood the others. Healing does not fix differences. It removes loneliness. What changed that day was not Mara Ellison's world in any measurable clinical sense. Sound did not return, and the barriers she had navigated all her life did not suddenly disappear. Yet something fundamental shifted in how she occupied space. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not defined by what she lacked, but by what she shared. The feeling was subtle, but it reached deeper than any accommodation ever had. She noticed it in the way she no longer felt the need to scan the room for exits, in how her body remained relaxed instead of braced. The familiar expectation of exclusion loosened its hold. She was still deaf, still accustomed to navigating a world built without her in mind, but she was no longer alone inside that reality. Belonging, she realized, did not require sameness. It required intention. Daniel experienced his own quiet transformation as the moment settled into memory. Emotional closure had once felt like protection, a necessary wall built from past losses. That wall had kept him functioning, but it had also kept him distant. Watching his children engage with openness and consistency forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. Safety did not come from shutting down feeling. It came from learning how to stay present without being consumed by fear. Recognized that his children had learned resilience not only from his sacrifices, but from the spaces he had unintentionally left open. In those spaces, they had developed empathy strong enough to guide them toward others. Instead of correcting or containing that instinct, he allowed himself to honor it. In doing so, he felt something inside him soften, a long-held tension easing as he redefined what strength could look like. The triplets absorbed the experience in ways that would shape them quietly over time. They had witnessed empathy in action, not as a lesson or a performance, but as a lived choice. They saw how effort could bridge difference, how staying when others might leave could transform a moment into meaning. It was not framed as kindness toward someone less fortunate. It was connection between equals, rooted in attention and respect. For them, the memory would not center on sign language or silence. It would center on the feeling of being part of something that mattered, of recognizing another person's humanity and responding without hesitation. That understanding would become part of how they moved through the world, an internal compass guiding future interactions long after the details blurred. What emerged between them all was not dependency, but the early shape of chosen family. No roles were assigned, no promises spoken aloud. Yet there was an unmistakable sense of alignment, a recognition that family could be built through shared presence rather than shared history. It was not about replacing what had been lost in any of their lives. It was about adding something new, something grounded in choice. Mara felt the significance of that realization settle gently. She was not being rescued or included out of obligation. She was being welcomed through effort, through a willingness to meet her where she was. That distinction reframed her understanding of connection. Belonging was not something granted by proximity or convenience. It was something created together, moment by moment. For Daniel, the day offered a hopeful reframing of single parenthood. He had often carried the weight of doing everything alone, believing that endurance was the only option. What he saw instead was the possibility of shared emotional labor, of allowing others into the circle without fear of collapse. His loneliness, long buried under responsibility, surfaced briefly, not as pain, but as something finally acknowledged. The cafe returned to its ordinary rhythm eventually, but what lingered did not belong to that place. It belonged to the internal shifts that had taken root. Isolation no longer felt inevitable. Connection no longer felt reckless. Hope emerged not as a dramatic promise, but as a steady presence, grounded in what had already proven possible. None of them left unchanged. The woman who had once prepared to disappear quietly carried with her the knowledge that she could be chosen. The father who had survived by narrowing his world understood that expansion did not have to mean loss. The children who had acted on instinct saw that empathy had power beyond intention. That day did not erase past wounds or guarantee future certainty. What it offered instead was direction. It showed that healing could exist without fixing, that redemption could unfold without spectacle. In choosing to stay, to see, and to respond, they had rewritten something essential within themselves. The connection that began in silence did not end there. It moved forward, shaped by memory and meaning, ready to be carried into whatever came next. What began without sound now carried purpose, and as they stepped back into their separate paths, each of them sensed that this story was not closing. It was only learning how to continue. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Support stories that choose empathy over indifference by liking and sharing this video. Subscribe to be part of a space where quiet moments still matter and human connection comes first. Because sometimes one small choice to stay can change someone's entire day or life. So here's the question. How many times has someone quietly needed you, and you didn't realize until it was almost too late?